Well, hi again, Jim Larson, of course, your instructor down here in Ashland. I say down because we're just a few miles from California border. I want to talk to you today about the chapter that is generally thought of as the prodigal son. But I think by the time you finish reading this and thinking about it, you'd prefer to call this chapter the lost chapter because there's a lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. But the story really is about the older brother. Now, Luke 15. I like to say that Jesus got people leaning and nodding. And here's how he did it. He'd tell a story. He'd say, a woman had, a shepherd had 100 sheep. And he lost one, and he searched for it, and when he found it, he called his neighbors in. He said, let's have a party. And that would get somebody leaning and nodding. If I told you that story about a man who lost something and he found it, he'd say, yeah, isn't that great? He had a little party. Yes, and then he goes on to say there was a woman who had 10 coins, and she lost one coin and searched high and low and finally found it, called her neighbors in and said, hey, I found it. Let's have a little party. And I think someone listening to this story would say, yeah, sure. What's wrong with that? It's a good story. Then he says there was a man who had two boys and he lost one. Now, the way he lost the boy was the boy demanded his inheritance ahead of time, as if to say to his father, I can't wait for you to die. I want my money now. So as soon as he got that money, he ran off and began to squander it. That's why it's called a prodigal, someone who is so, you're generous to the point, you're extravagant to the point of your loss. That's what it means. It doesn't mean wayward. Sometimes we think that. But he's so generous and so giving that he ends up being broke. He's feeding pigs, and the pig food is looking pretty good to him. And one day he comes to his senses and he says to himself, I could go home and I could live as one of my father's servants. I could no longer be his son, but maybe I could be a servant. And so he brushes himself off, and all the way home he's rehearsing what he's going to say to his father. I've sinned against you. I don't deserve to be your son. Let me be a servant. But as he approaches home, his father sees him, runs from the house, embraces the son, and before the son can even get his story out, the father's saying things like to the servants, he's saying, bring the robe, and bring the shoes, bring the special ring, kill the fatted calf, do all of those things. And his son is barely able to blurt it out. I don't deserve this. And his father takes him home and welcomes him. Well, all of that is to lead up to the real point of this story. And if you don't see this last part, you're going to miss what it's all about. Because you see, Jesus was talking to some people who didn't like it, that he was hanging out with sinners, the lower rung, the lower strata of his society. And the religious leaders were off to the side watching Jesus in judgment of him when he told them this story. Man loses a sheep, woman loses a coin, a man loses his son, and when he comes home he has a party, and you'd think that would be a good ending for the whole thing. What a nice story. But the problem is that out in the field there's the older brother. The older brother hears the noise, and he asks one of his servants, hey, what's going on over at the house? I hear a lot of commotion. And the servant says, it's your brother. He's come home. Oh, the older brother is upset. And he rushes to his father, and he says, what's going on? Your son takes off, spends all this money, spends on, his money on prostitutes and riotous living, and now he comes back and you accept him. I've been here all this time. I've been your faithful son. He never threw a party for me. He never killed an animal for me for a barbecue. And the father says to him, son, if this happened to you, I would have welcomed you home too. I love you. You're always with me. But you know what? Your brother was as good as dead. He was lost, but now he's found. We had to do this. Now, when the Pharisees heard this story, they knew Jesus was pointing at them. He was saying, this could be a nice thing. me spending time with down and outers, me being a friend to sinners. But instead, you stand over here folding your arms, looking down your noses. You're like that older brother. Why can't you be generous? If God is generous, why can't you? Just as this father was generous, and the older brother couldn't find it in himself to be kind, welcoming. It's really the story of the older brother.